would you agree that because a lot of the ancient world didn't think in terms of meta level questions, I'm not talking about generically the idea of metaphysics, but meta logic, meta ethics, meta mathematics, questions about language that would only say pop up after Vico, people like that, Giambattista Vico. So they didn't think about it like that, but we do have that transcendental argument statement from the Fountain of Knowledge, where I believe, and I think that if you got to hear the debate that I did with Dr. Malpass, who works in epistemology as well, he was making the case that nobody really thought that Aristotle was making a transcendental kind of argument in Metaphysics Book 7. But I think that the fact that John of Damascus in the Fount is relying on Aristotle so heavily in that book, the fact that he begins the book with that transcendental argument about how philosophy assumes a worldview and assumes logic, and if you were to be a sophist, then deny it. That's the argument that Aristotle gives against the sophist. So point being is that I think Dr. Malpass was wrong to say that it's not a transcendental argument, and nobody after Aristotle in the ancient world thought that it was, because I don't think he's read John of Damascus. But what would you say to somebody who says, for example, well, these arguments are not, I mean, I know it's a genetic fallacy, but these arguments are from Aristotle, or they're from Calvin and or not Calvin, Van Til or Bonson. You can't use that in this stuff. That's a Calvinist argument. What would you say to that?
I'd say stop talking. Please stop talking. No, of course I attempt to answer that. Again, one of the things Bonson and Van Til, who were Calvinists, picked up, obviously they didn't come up with this idea in a vacuum. They're pulling from sources, ancient sources. And again, the term transcendental argument, they're pulling from Immanuel Kant. Okay, but it doesn't matter if the phrase and the term transcendental argument isn't in the ancient literature in the patristics. The concepts there is, as you rightly point out. And of course, I don't think that you start to get this kind of self-reflection upon analyzing paradigms and starting points a little bit later within the philosophical community as a whole. Does that mean, therefore, that nobody assessed their presuppositions? Clearly not. You have St. John of Damascus, and you have Aristotle too, which is, I'd say that absolutely is a species of the transcendental argument. So, for example, you could use this, the three basic fundamental laws of thought: the law of identity, the law of exclude the middle, and the law of non-contradiction. What Aristotle's saying is that these fundamental laws are assumed in doing anything. It's assumed in making arguments, it's assumed in language, it's assumed for meaning. And in order for you to deny that the three fundamental laws of thought exist, guess what? You have to assume them. So, for example, what laws are you referring to? By the three fundamental laws, do you mean the three fundamental laws of thought? Check. You just assumed the law of identity. And by the three fundamental laws of thought, it's either the three fundamental laws of thought or it isn't. Yes. Then you've got law of exclude the middle. So it couldn't be that we're in this conversation talking about the three fundamental laws of thought and not the three fundamental laws of thought at the same time and in the same way. Yes. Then again, you've shown that you've assumed the law of non-contradiction. So in other words, in order to deny that, you have to assume it to deny it, which is self-stultifying.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, the Latins will know this, but stultifying from the Latin stultus, stupid. You made yourself stupid, right, by contradicting yourself. That is a transcendental argument, and that's exactly the sort of argument that we would make too, is that in order to deny the existence of God, you have to use, you're presupposing it, whether you consciously recognize that or not, as a foundation to deny it in the exact same way as you point out, Jay, that Aristotle illustrates. And therefore, it's a type of transcendental argument.
Right. When we think about our beliefs in a worldview scheme, and somebody was asking me the other day after that debate with Matt Dillahunty, they were like, why are you constantly talking about worldviews? Why do you keep saying paradigms? Why is that such a big deal to you? Well, the reason that it's such a big deal is because if that system that we've been talking about, classical foundationalism, is not correct, if it's, I mean, let's make a clear point here that we're not denying causality.
A foundation.
We're not denying foundations. We're not denying teleology. We're not denying any of those principles that people in that scheme use. We're saying that those aren't the starting points that those philosophers and systematic people think it is. It doesn't work the way they think it does. It's not that there's no cause. There absolutely is causality. There absolutely is teleology. So when we get to think about the systems as webs of belief, right? So I would conceive of it like, imagine a web, and then in my scheme, God is in the middle of the web, and then like out from that web are the other, you could say properly basic beliefs that I have, like I believe in an external world or a self, or that there are causal relations, that there's purpose in the world, right? All those kind of categories. And then out from those webs, you could say that there's other beliefs that I have, that words have meaning and all that kind of stuff. And the reason for the web model is because it's illustrative to help to show us that there's no node in the web that's not connected to the other nodes, right? My belief in God is going to be connected to those other things, right? Now, and that's not saying they're all equal either, that God is more foundational than those others, but my belief in words and how they work is not going to be disconnected from the other things going on in this worldview, in this web model, as opposed to the model of, well, there's just some beliefs that are the basic starting point that we all know and have in common, and then that's our common ground starting point, and then we just kind of stack the other beliefs on top of that. That would be kind of the foundationalist model if we were to sketch it out, right? And it's not wrong to say, again, as you pointed out, that there's no starting points. It doesn't matter where you start. You could start with any. You could start with a leaf. You could start with logic. You could start with numbers. You could start with teleology. That doesn't mean that the starting point has a metaphysical primacy, therefore. Anyway, so do you think that the web model is helpful? Is that a better way of kind of looking at it, or do you have a better descriptor?
No, I think that's absolutely an excellent way to put it, is that we all subscribe to a worldview and paradigm, as you pointed out, which Quine says is the web of beliefs, and that neither word, proposition, or any one concept exists in isolation, has its meaning and truth value in virtue of that, but they're all contingent upon one another, hanging on one another. In other words, a proposition or a word in one paradigm is going to mean something completely different in another paradigm. Why? Because of the web of beliefs, that it's all holding itself together. And Quine has this wonderful illustration of Gavagai and his thesis of the indeterminacy of translation thesis. And what that is imagine that we're in the jungle somewhere, and you see the natives chasing a rabbit, and they're yelling out Gavagai. Now, you might assume that means rabbit.
Oh, I remember this. Yes.
Do you remember this?
This is where he says that we would think perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to go from memory. So we would think perhaps that what he means is the individual rabbit running, and what perhaps is meant by the tribe is the whole scenery, including the background and all that. Is that right? Okay.
That's right. Or, I mean, it could mean maybe they have a theory of reincarnation in their ancestors, and they're saying Grandpa's Gavagai.
Yeah, it could mean a whole bunch of different things, right?
You wouldn't know unless you were embedded within that paradigm and culture. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's a wonderful illustration. And again, this is played out. Kant's starting to touch on this, and the Kantian philosopher Wilfrid Sellars plays up on this with his coherentism. And Wilfrid Sellars is a great philosopher. He's a naturalist, but he's a great philosopher to critique classical foundationalism. And what he says is that there is no simple brute facts. So this is exactly what the classical foundationalist wants to assert, that there is this pretended neutrality and that we have brute facts. Well, all facts, he argues, are colored by your paradigm, just as Quine pointed out with the Gavagai.
And by the way, the fact that he's not a Calvinist saying that, in a way, illustrates that it doesn't require the Calvinist doctrine of depravity to understand that beliefs or propositions are theory-laden. That's the point.
Yeah, that's right. And that's an excellent, that's the term you want to use. All things are theory-laden. And that, as Wilfred Sellers says, you don't just see something. You see something as, and using the Kantian language, under a concept. For example, if somebody disagrees with that and is going to object with that, just ask them, do you think the way an infant's going to see that table is the exact same way that you're going to see it? Of course not, because you have that sense data subsumed with under a whole host of concepts that the infant doesn't.
Yes.
And he uses that as an analogy as far as paradigms too, that again, you're going to see that fact in a very different way.
That's a devastating argument. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, it's a great argument, and that's what transcendental arguments are going to pick up. And people feel so strange because they're not getting the transcendental argument because they're constantly operating on the assumption of a traditional classical foundationalist idea, and that they're not going to admit that no, you've committed to certain presuppositions, and that all of your facts, propositions, and beliefs, in fact, do hang on one another and are colored by on. And the whole history of science should show us this. That, and I mean, just comparing the Ptolemaic system, where you have a geocentric universe, to the Copernican model of the heliocentric, right? You could use the same terms and concepts. They take on a whole new meaning in virtue of the paradigm, and the whole history of philosophy, of science, demonstrates this too. And no wonder that's where it arose from.
This is why Kuhn is so good. Kuhn is wrong in his ultimate conclusions that that paradigms are incommensurable and you can't ever judge between them. But he's right in his critique that you're making right here, which is that if you just look at the way scientific revolutions occur, it shows that everybody wasn't just some neutral observer that went and, everybody looked at the facts, and once we tallied up the facts, we saw that there were 17,000 facts on this side and there were 2,000 facts on this side, therefore 17,000. Yeah, I mean, that's absurd, and that's not how humans operate. That's not how the world works. We don't work that way. And I think it's been many years since I was looking into Husserl and Heidegger, but one of my great grad classes, well, actually I had two, one on Husserl and one on Heidegger, but was concerning a great point that touches on this that Heidegger made, where a lot of the Husserl and Heidegger studied under Husserl, and then there's a story that I think Dermot Moran tells when I got to hear one of his lectures one time, and he said that.
Did you hear him? He was my professor.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow. Yeah, no,
I studied Husserl and Heidegger under Dermot.
Oh, cool. I bumped into him at one time right before the lecture, and I slammed the door into him by accident. So
nice one.
If he doesn't know who I am, but he might remember me as the guy who hit him with the door at the University of Memphis many years ago. But so he told this funny story about how Husserl had the whole class for one whole summer. All the class did was go and do bracketing analysis, or attempting to have a bracket analysis of a mailbox, and they sat and they tried to do mereology, not Mariology, but mereology, the parts holes analysis, and you always only see one angle of the mailbox. You never see the backside of it. You have to move around. So they're doing this for a whole summer on this mailbox, right? And Heidegger made the great joke that's not how anybody in the world interprets mailboxes. I mean, it's not that there's no value in that, but that's not the life being, you could say, that we all have of interpreting mailboxes. When we come to the mailbox, we come to a mailbox with all the assumptions and the past life that we have about mailboxes. That, maybe maybe when I was a kid, I bumped my head on a mailbox, and I don't like mailboxes, right? Because I've had that bad. So I come with all that preconceived notion, and maybe I've only in my life seen pink mailboxes, and so I think, well, mailboxes are usually pink and they hurt. I mean, so I'm gonna have. I mean, I may be wrong, but I'm gonna have those preconceptions when I come to interpret the mailbox. And I make the same point too about the evidentialist apologists when they do the earthworm, right? Like when they interpret the earthworm, they interpret it because they're Christians and because they believe in creation and they believe in design. When the atheist interprets the earthworm, he interprets it from a completely different way. And I think Hume made this great point when he was contrasting the design argument, and he said, you know, when I look out there, there is design, but he's like, when I see a carrot through carrot seeds produce another carrot, that's what I see the universe as. It's just a self-generating bunch of carrots. It's like the great pumpkin, and pumpkins just produce more pumpkins. And so nowhere in this chain of pumpkins is there like the supernatural great pumpkin, Charlie Brown. There's only pumpkins, right? That's essentially the argument that Hume was making. I think he has a good point that design itself is going to be interpreted within the paradigm and framework that you have.
Absolutely.
So for us, design has a specific meaning that God designed the world. And it's fine to use the model of Aristotle, the triadic model that Maximus does in the 200 chapters, where he says that you can have the first cause, you can have the sustaining middle point of all reality, and then you have the telos of everything and of each individual thing. It's fine to use those Aristotelian four causes if you want. You can structure it like 3 or by 4, either however you want to do it. It doesn't matter. The problem is not with those steps or with those ideas. The problem is that they're not pre-interpreted. They're not. Excuse me. They are pre-interpreted. They're theory-laden. They're not self-evident outside of a context.